the Robinhood tokenized stocks app versus like the US app. They basically look like the same thing. One is powered by traditional brokerage and one is powered by tokenized rails. The most exciting thing about this relationship for me is not that they're bringing crypto to their products, it's that they're powering their current products with crypto.
AJ Warner is Chief Strategy Officer at Offchain Labs, builders of Arbitrum, one of Ethereum's top layer 2s with over $4 billion in TVL. From legal beginnings to shaping strategy for one of Web3's most vital scaling solutions, AJ reveals how crypto infrastructure is quietly transforming mainstream finance with partnerships like Robinhood.
If Ethereum launched today, what would it be?
If Ethereum launched today, it wouldn't be Ethereum. It's a different time. It's a different era. And I think that the approach that we're seeing, people are becoming much more commercial. They're much more business-oriented in how they design blockchain architectures. And for better or for worse, it's just a different time, and you have to have your strategies adapt to the time that you're in.
To start off, I always like to ask our guests, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you even got into this industry?
Sure. Bit of a circuitous route to get here on a professional perspective.
Sure.
I've been in this space personally since about 2014. I discovered Bitcoin when I was in law school. I did a small seminar it was right after the Silk Road sort of bust by the FBI, and it was really a question about like a lot of policy questions around money transmission. I really fell down the rabbit hole and got extremely passionate about the space. Fast forward to 2018, I finished my JD MBA. I was practicing as a real estate lawyer in New York City, doing mainly development deals, so completely nothing to do with crypto whatsoever.
I was going to say, how did that lawyer to this? Yeah,
let's talk about it. We'll get there. So was working, in a personal capacity, is like obviously loving crypto. But Stephen, who you just mentioned in your introduction that you've had on the show before, Stephen and we actually met in 2008, the first day of college. We were not roommates. We were in the dormitories next to each other, connected by a bathroom. And when I started back in my crypto journey, we obviously, we're still friendly, but we reconnected on a much deeper level. In 2018, he's like, I'm starting this new thing called Arbitrum. It sounds really cool. So I joined first informally as like their lawyer and as sort of like an informal advisor, and joined full-time formally once there was like something on the business side to do, which was when we launched the alpha testnet in 2020. So really was doing nothing professionally crypto related before this, but it was a personal passion, and Steven and I decided to work on this together right when they were basically starting out the non-engineering components of the business.
Amazing. So the takeaway is to keep your friendships and relationships from early days.
Exactly. You never know. It's funny because just like, I didn't realize Stephen was so this was in 2014, maybe early 2015. I didn't realize Stephen was in crypto. I knew he was doing computer science, but I didn't realize sort of his relationship with Bitcoin. The first Bitcoin book I bought was this textbook, and I read it cover to cover. Then I closed and I realized that it was Stephen's name was as one of the authors. And I'm just I can't believe I just paid $65 for this on Amazon. I should have just asked him for it. So it was
you were supporting him, yeah.
So I was really funny to sort of see how, your worlds can collide in very weird ways. And, obviously we're extremely close friends now, and we've been working together for 5 years.
Yeah, Stephen's great. That's awesome. I love that story. I feel like that's happened to me before, where I've just like been reading something, or I went to something and I'm like, wait, you work here? Or, or like you're in this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a really small world, and it's a really eclectic collection of people and backgrounds in crypto. It's one of, I guess now it's sort of going more mainstream. You have people who are starting their careers in crypto. But like 5-6 years ago, it was, everybody had, their own journey and their own story. So it's a great industry.
Yeah, that's why I always like to ask that question. But when it comes to building a strategy for one of the largest L2s out there, what are the top priorities for you? Like, walk us through what your job even looks like.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I wear a number of different hats at Offchain Labs. I spend most of my time still primarily focusing on business development and growth for the Arbitrum ecosystem. I'm also on a committee membership for the Arbitrum DAO, which is intended to steward sort of the future vision. That's in a personal capacity, the future vision of the Arbitrum protocol, treasury, etc. At Offchain Labs, I also work closely with Ira, for example, who's another guest, I think, on your show, on Tandem. So we work closely. That's almost like the incubation and venture studio out of Offchain Labs, and some corporate development work that we do, around new products, new projects, etc. So spend a lot of time, but specifically on Arbitrum, I think our strategy has been very interesting, and we have a very unique product set compared to a lot of our peers and competitors. And you obviously mentioned Robinhood. We'll talk about how this interacts with sort of, I think, the Robinhood thesis for why they chose to work with us. But one of the places which is interesting is what you're starting to see is there's public blockchains and there's enterprises and organizations that want to launch their own blockchains. And we'll talk about the reasons why that is or isn't a good idea and who's a good candidate for that. But what's unique about Arbitrum is that we have like what I call a barbell product strategy around the Arbitrum platform. And if you look at Arbitrum One, which, like you said, is either first or second basically on every metric amongst all L2s, it's a top 5 blockchain by economic activity. And when you look at the Arbitrum tech stack's adoption and its feature sets, it's the most adopted, or again, maybe at worst, the second most adopted. And there really isn't another blockchain sort of platform that can make both of those claims. If you look at even some of the most major blockchains like Ethereum and Solana, they're selling you on this vision of launching a public monolithic blockchain. And if you talk to some of our competitors in the L2s, they might have like a blockchain stack, like the Optimism superchain, for example, but they might not have the robust public blockchain architecture with a lot of liquidity, applications, and the value proposition of composability. And what this really unique structural advantage allows us to do is really control the relationship throughout the developer journey, right? So there's a lot of enterprises or solo developers or early stage startups that for what they want to do or for components of their technology, it's really important for them to be on a public blockchain. And for their other components, or whether it's in the life cycle, we'll talk about Robinhood in a second, is really important and makes a lot of sense for them to be on their own blockchain or to have their own custom implementation of the Arbitrum stack. And we can offer them that mix and match or that migration strategy without changing technology stacks, without working with different teams, without working within a different ecosystem. So we can really give them that flexibility from a product perspective. So when you come and talk to me and say, this is what I want to do at the product level, how would I implement it? We really have a lot of different tools that we can offer. And we can talk through some of the product features. And that, I think, from a strategic level, is the highest priority for us, is to maintain the power of both sides of that barbell. We want the Arbitrum platform to offer a top 5 blockchain by economic activity, top 5 what I call economic zone, as well as the ability and the best-in-class product suite to launch your own blockchain so we can have the entirety of the developer relationship.
And you say economic value. How would you characterize that? Because there's a lot of different metrics and categories within this space that could probably point to a lot of areas to water it down, so to speak. But in your eyes, like, what is actually valuable, and like, what is the value on that barbell that Arbitrum is bringing in? On the
Arbitrum One side, so there's a lot of different metrics. For me, for what we are prioritizing today, it's really about liquidity on the public chain. So, whether that's people who want to launch their own token, whether that's if you want to launch a new DeFi primitive, how easy is it for you to be able to get liquidity? Whether it's even like if you want to launch your own application, how quickly can you get liquidity? So for example, and some people know this, some people might not be aware, like Hyperliquid sources all of their liquidity on USDC from Arbitrum, right? And they've done an incredible job of growing that. That's like $5 billion of TVL that they source from Arbitrum. And if you speak to their team, and the reason why they bootstrap their application there is, secure, cheap, decentralized, and liquid. And those are the principles of, actually one I have to add is credibly neutral, which I think is a really important component of the Arbitrum One side of the strategy. So we want to make sure that we can continue to maintain that for people who believe in the needs for liquidity, composability, and to make it the most welcoming environment for everybody. So if I looked at like specific metrics, it's probably a hybrid of TVL and like velocity of money, whether that's volume across like, derivatives like perps or even spot, like, DEX trading, for example, as well as stablecoin liquidity. One of the things that I like to say about Arbitrum, which is really a source of pride, across all layer 2s, Arbitrum has the most USDC liquidity. It also has the most USDT liquidity. And it's also the only L2 that Paxos and PayPal support today. So if you look at like the major stable coins that are, in existence, Arbitrum's got a home for all three of them. Like I said, Hyperliquid sources their USDC from Arbitrum. And then if you look at like Tether's strategy with USDT 0 and interoperability, they chose Arbitrum as the hub chain. So if you go to a lot of different, hop across interoperability using USDT, Arbitrum is the settlement layer for that. So that point of being incredibly neutral is really important and critical to our vision. We want to be welcoming on the Arbitrum One public infrastructure side to everyone, to be the best home for them to be able to launch their applications and continue to compound those liquidity.
Mm-hmm. What about other L2s? Or that's not possible. Can they come home to Arbitrum?
Other L2s?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Like, can other L2s kind of consolidate and move on to Arbitrum? Yeah.
So, there's a lot of them interact with Arbitrum through bridging, but what we've built with our architecture is a lot of the Arbitrum Orbits, which is like Arbitrum Orbit's our term for launching your own chain. They launch as layer 3s on top of Arbitrum One. So, for example, Ape Chain, which is the chain that like Yuga Labs is building for the ApeCoin community, they have a chain that lives on top of Arbitrum One and settles to Arbitrum. And that's like an architecture that we really support and appreciate. And the rationale behind it is they want their own economic environment because they've architected the chain to be like very immersed in their ape experience. So for example, the custom gas token is all ape. There's native staking when you enter the chain. So those are things you couldn't do on a public chain, right? Like no public chain is going to adopt ape as its gas fee token unless it's intended to serve the ApeCoin community. But their primary goal is not to have like a huge DeFi ecosystem. It's much more about gaming, consumer, and culture. So that L2, L3 interaction actually is they're sourcing all the liquidity from Arbitrum into their network, right? So you do have, they might not be called L2s, but you do have a lot of teams that are building, we probably have around 30 or 40 chains that are using this architecture that are essentially sourcing and having better interoperability with Arbitrum One. As part of their product. The vision here is like Arbitrum One, almost like a Grand Central Station, right? You might have a lot of different train networks and ecosystems that are building around it, and that is the core hub of connectivity between them. So, a lot of the other L2s with competing stacks, they might not source liquidity from Arbitrum, but they might use it for interoperability. But actually, like just to go back to the other end of the strategy, on the stack side, our goal is to have, and I like to use this tagline, Arbitrum everywhere. We want the Arbitrum technology stack to be available to everyone everywhere. So if you even look at other L2s like Base, which is the other major leading L2 blockchain, if you look at their app chains that are built on top of it, the leading ones are actually using the Arbitrum stack. So for example, Blackbird, which is like the restaurant loyalty program, under the hood, it's running Arbitrum technology. And the same with like Degen Chain, right? They're very like a pivotal component and critical component of the Farcaster ecosystem, very logical for them to be a part of the broader Base community. But from a technology perspective, Arbitrum was best suited to match their needs. So, we like to say Arbitrum everywhere because it's in many ways our vision and mandate. We want the technology stack to be everywhere, and that's a core part of our strategy. We don't think everybody should be on Arbitrum One, but we want everybody to feel touched with the Arbitrum ecosystem and the Arbitrum economy.
That's so interesting. I did not know Blackbird was built on Arbitrum's technology too. We had them on the show as well, and nice. I love Blackbird. Yeah, I'm a Blackbird fan.
There you go.
But okay, so Arbitrum One is separate from Arbitrum.
So Arbitrum is this gets confusing. There's a lot of different.
Give us the distinction because I don't think everyone knows it.
So Arbitrum One is what people call Arbitrum, like the chain. Is right. We call that Arbitrum One. Mm-hmm. That is like the name for it, right? We used to colloquially refer to it as Arbitrum before there was like this proliferation of people using our technology stack, but it's called technically Arbitrum One. So if you want to look at its metrics, you'll find it on different websites as Arbitrum One. Arbitrum Orbit is the product which lets you launch your own stack. And when we think about the platform, which we call Arbitrum, it's this collection of both. It's the ability to launch your own chain if you want to launch on the public Arbitrum One chain. We roll that all up into Arbitrum. And our whole thought process and the vision behind we think about it is, and again, this is the power of that platform, I'm not trying to sell you to launch an Arbitrum One, or I'm trying to sell you to launch a chain. I'm trying to sell you to use our technology however makes the most sense, right? So I'm not trying to win, the Blackbird example, I'm not telling them migrate to Arbitrum. I'm trying to say, I understand why you're building in Base. You've been doing that for years. It makes a lot of sense for your product. If you want to scale and launch your own chain, we have the best solution for you. And that's really the vision for what we have. And the business model is intended to reflect that. The way it works is if you launch on the public Arbitrum chain, obviously you pay transaction fees to Arbitrum like any other blockchain. If you launch your own chain, we have what we call like almost like a freemium model. If you do that thing I described before, which is like an L3 that settles to Arbitrum One, that's like free. You don't have to pay anything. So if you are ApeChain, for example, you have no obligations to pay any of your transaction fees to Arbitrum. And the rationale is you're implicitly paying because in order to onboard into ApeChain, you have to go through Arbitrum. So everything settles to Arbitrum. And also you're creating a lot of network effects for the public blockchain. But if you want to use the Arbitrum stack in another way, let's say you want to launch your own L2 or you want to launch an L3 in another ecosystem, all you have to do is pay a 10% profit share as part of what we call the Arbitrum expansion program. So it's permissionless. You don't have to like sign any contracts or any papers, but just part of like the deployment, you have a fee splitter, which separates 10% profit share. So
makes sense.
Robinhood is doing that. It seems like, a lot, we actually don't get a lot of pushback on the business model. Generally speaking, it's like a pretty reasonable split for providing like a really good technology stack for people who want to use it however they can.
It's like white labeled versus not white labeled.
Yeah, in some ways, exactly.
There we go. Yeah. On the strategy front, I'm curious, AJ, what are some tactics you have noticed that really don't work in crypto?
What I always tell my team is one of the things that happened historically in Web 2 is like huge network effects created a moat for products. So like you can like look at like Uber's probably the best example, right? Lost billions of dollars for like consecutive years, like many consecutive years.
Those were the days.
Right, exactly. Like you kept
when it was like a $6 Uber.
Like, I got another $15. I got that yesterday. Like fantastic.
Exactly.
Right? But if you were like a student and you modeled it, you kind of realized that like this is gonna end and like it's gonna be like a multiple $100 billion business because they are so entrenched in everything that I do around transportation.
Right.
And I think a lot of crypto companies and blockchains have tried to adopt the Uber model. The problem is that it doesn't work nearly as well for a couple of reasons. One is it's much easier for your users to migrate as well as your developers. So whoever your target audience, whether it's users and liquidity or it's developers, it's much easier for them to migrate. Two, it's also much easier for your competitors to bootstrap. So like you can launch a token and now you have a lot of potential funding for incentives or whatever it is, like some sort of version of a vampire attack. And that's, I think, something that a lot of blockchains have tried doing. Like if we spend on this, we're going to be good. But it's very, very hard to defend that. The things that I think work for defensibility in crypto is, to compound this also in crypto, is a lot of projects, fully open source all components of their stack, which is essentially inviting, in some ways, competition. And I'm not trying to criticize it. I think it's important to the ethos. What we did with the Arbitrum expansion program, for example, is it's not fully open source. It was a variant of the business source license, like which Uniswap and Aave and others use, which requires you to contribute back in order to be able to use the software permissionlessly.
Right.
But that's a really hard thing about crypto. So the things that I think in crypto do help with defensibility are being really quick to market, solving hardest problems, and having a sustainable business model. A lot of people try doing things without a sustainable business model, and it can work for like a short amount of time. It doesn't work in perpetuity, at least from what I've seen. It's very, very hard to, even if, for example, like Ethereum, which is, I think, obviously by far the largest smart contract platform existed today. If Ethereum launched today, it wouldn't be Ethereum. It's like, it's a different time. It's a different era. And I think that the approach that we're seeing, people are becoming much more commercial. They're much more business oriented in how they design blockchain architectures. And for better or for worse, I obviously I love Ethereum. I've been part of the Ethereum ecosystem since 2015 myself. But it's just a different time, and you have to have your strategies adapt to the time that you're in.
If Ethereum launched today, what would it be equated to?
It would be tough. I mean, it depends. The thing about Ethereum that is its moat is the Ethereum virtual machine. And the other thing, and I think like Tom Lee's done like a really good job of this. Today, it is the most robust, secure settlement layer. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But that's only true because it had years and years of being able to get to that point. But without being at that point, it wouldn't be able to have that, impact and effect.
Right. No, that makes sense. Before, you also talked about how some chains don't really need to be chains. I think you said it more eloquently than I did. But there's a proliferation, I would say, in the past 12 to 18 months of just chains popping up, whether or not it's necessary or it's like a team that created one. And I don't want to name names. You can name names, but you kind of get the point I'm getting at. Sometimes I see them and I'm like, that makes sense. And then other times I see them and I'm like, I'm not really sure why you did that. Maybe to own the market share, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think about it?
Okay, so I'll tell you our thesis. There's a lot of people. So this goes, I'm going to get down a rabbit hole a little bit here with L1 versus L2s because
Sure.
I think it's really important to understanding how L2s operate, to understand the distinction. In order to launch your own L1 blockchain, it's actually very difficult. And it's not difficult from a technology perspective. It's very difficult from an incentives perspective. What I mean by that is it's very hard to do without a token. You kind of need a token because you need to pay validators. And most of these validators, especially in the earlies, and this is true of every network. It was true of Ethereum. It's true of Bitcoin. It's true of Solana. Your transaction fees are not going to cover the amount that you have to pay to your validators. So you need inflation, and that all usually comes from token inflation of the protocol. And, some L1s today are paying hundreds of millions of dollars in what we almost call a security budget in order to bootstrap a validator network for the blockchain. That's probably the biggest bug of being an L1. If you launch an L2, you don't have to do that. If you look at Arbitrum today, Arbitrum validators, you don't have to incentivize validators because it gets security and consensus from Ethereum.
But they all launch tokens anyways. So
the launching of tokens for very different reasons, and we'll talk about that in a second, it's much more, let's put that aside for a second. Let me just finish this thought. I don't want to get distracted. The business model of L2s, whether or not an L2 launches a token, is much more like a traditional SaaS style enterprise business model in the sense that for every dollar of transaction fees that Arbitrum One gets, and this is true for Base and true for Optimism, Mainnet, etc., pays about 5 cents to Ethereum Layer 1 for security, and then it retains 95 cents, right? And whether or not that's a token, you have a token, that's how the business model works. So if you launch on a public chain versus owning your own chain, you're paying operating expenses of 100% of your costs, right? So if you spend $100 in transaction fees on a public chain, that's an operating expense of 100. If you're running the chain, even if you have an application that's doing it, you basically have a 95% cost recovery on your transaction fees, right? And everybody else's transactions that they're doing on your blockchain is like a 95% gross profit margin business, right? So it's a very compelling business if you have scale. So for example, Coinbase and their vision of everything they want to do on chain, they have enough users, they have enough of a mandate. It makes a lot of sense for them to, instead of being a tenant, become a landlord. So that's one obvious example of where somebody should, in my opinion, have their own chain. I think there are very few organizations in crypto. I think Robinhood's a great example of one that fits this bill of they have enough of a mandate to launch their own chain. And they should be launching their own chain because, again, they have the ability to convert operating expenses into gross profit margin, or at least a 95% cost recovery on their own operating expenses. The second component of this around these network effects and why you might want to launch your own chain is really around MEV. For your users that might be less
Max
familiar,
extractable value.
maximum extractable value.
Yes.
If you are on a public blockchain, and that's essentially like payment for order flow or priority fees. If you are on a public blockchain, you are subject to the MEV policy of that blockchain. And to make it matters worse, not only are you subject to it, you also don't get to keep it or internalize it. The blockchain does. If you have your own chain, you can set what the strategy around MEV is, but also keep it for yourself, right? So if you think about the equivalent of payment for order flow in like a traditional Web2 business, it's almost like MEV strategies in blockchains. So that's a critical thing for a lot of enterprises like Robinhood or other financial institutions that might have major economic activity flowing through their network. Another example of a chain that's doing this, it's like a little bit of a different mandate because they might not have the users, but they have the assets. We're building with Athena and Securitize, we're building the Converge blockchain. Again, if you think about Athena has a lot of stablecoin distribution, Securitize is obviously the leading, like I would say, token issuance platform. They have a huge mandate on the asset side, having control of the MEV strategy and also being able to internalize their operating expenses, I think is going to be a really critical component of growth. So that's like one main reason and one huge difference between L1s and L2s of why you might see a lot of people launching chains.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good explainer, honestly. I don't think we've ever had anyone kind of dive into it like that.
Okay, so thankful. Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time on this.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, the second main reason, and this is where I'd say the majority of teams that are building the Arbitrum platform are using it, and I touched on it a little bit with Yuga and ApeChain, is they want the chain to become a part of the product, right? So it's less about paying less transaction fees or internalizing it, because some of these chains make like basically no money. But the important thing to remember is it's not an L1. An L1, if you make no money, is a death sentence and a death spiral. Here, you can run an L2 blockchain at like $5,000 a month. It's a very scalable thing because your security expenses is a function of revenue, right? Because Ethereum charges you as a percentage of transaction fee. It doesn't charge you like a bootstrap fee or a validator fee. So we see teams that want to, for example, have their token be the native token of the network for the user experience. Or we've seen teams that even use stablecoins as the native token of the network because they're trying to build a consumer blockchain. Or we see teams that really want to change the mechanics of the blockchain. We've seen teams like build out that you can't launch a regular wallet. You can only use a KYC compliant smart contract wallet if you want to use the network, because they're trying to target like a certain RWA subclass. We've seen teams try to enforce in the node infrastructure creator royalties because it's an NFT focused chain. So you can do all of these different things. And that's like, I would say, the second class of organizations that are launching blockchains and that we've really positioned the Arbitrum tech stack to be available for, which is opinionated block space. Right? So I'm not trying to launch a generic chain. I'm trying to launch a chain that's a component of my product. And this can really only work well in L2s because you don't have high startup costs. The third component is for use cases that have high susceptibility on their business model to noisy neighbors. And we see this more frequently in either gaming with a lot of high intense, very low value transactions, or even some DePIN projects. So some of these DePIN projects, they might have like their core token and capital markets be on a public chain like Arbitrum One, but they have like millions of transactions that are just like ledger settlements. They can't be subject to congestion on a public blockchain. They want full control because they're really utilizing this as like a ledger more so than like an economic hub. So that's, I think, probably the third sort of core thesis of where we see the value of chains. What's happened is, I think, our competitors have taken a different approach than we than we have is what you've, I think, seen is a lot of like really generic chains launch, right? It's the same tech stack, no changes whatsoever, just like a different enterprise name slapped onto it. And that I think has really been sort of where like the products are not really delivering value. And I don't blame people necessarily for trying. I don't mind if people try things, but what we've tried to do with the Arbitrum stack is we want as much flexibility and modularity so that the chain can become a part of your product. We want you to be as opinionated, even if you have a mandate like Robinhood, where you can launch it for like economic reasons, we still want the chain to be opinionated to serve what you want it to serve. A lot of our competitors have more thought about how they interact governance and interoperability with the chain. And I think that's impacted the product focus of the chain. So anyways, not to spend too much time on some of our competitors' strategy, but that's how we think about it and why people should launch their own chains. To answer your other question, sort of where you mentioned a lot of L2s still launch tokens, this is perhaps the most misunderstood component of L2 tokens. I'll talk about Arbitrum and its tokens relationship with the technology. Again, what other people do is not really for me to comment as much, but what Arbitrum does well, and the most important thing to recognize about L2s is when you have your L1, L2 architecture, if there's let's say a critical bug, or if you want to upgrade the L1, then you have like a mechanism to fork, right? So Ethereum forks like probably twice a year on average for upgrades. We name them the different things like Fusaka, the merge, whatever it is. In order to do that, you have the validators basically agree that we need to fork the consensus to insert this change into the protocol. And L2 cannot fork without the L1 forking underneath it. Because remember, Arbitrum, like for example, sits on top of Ethereum. So the only way for either Arbitrum to respond to a vulnerability or for Arbitrum to upgrade and make sure that the protocol remains the best, most robust protocol in existence, it must fork. It cannot fork. It must upgrade. So the role of the token holders is to manage these upgrades. So for example, Offchain Labs cannot change the software Arbitrum One without it going through a token holder vote and a majority vote by the token holders passing. And then there's like a 20-day time delay before the upgrade is implemented for anybody who might disagree with it to get their assets off the blockchain. The other thing, and this is not technical, but this is business. Remember how I said about a 95% gross profit margin business? This is another superpower of L2s versus L1s. When you're an L1 blockchain, if you earn $100 in transaction fees, you pass it through to your stakers because you need to for security, and you're probably giving them inflation issuance on top of it in the form of like protocol rewards. For the L2, if you have $1 or $100 of transaction fees, you pay 5% to Ethereum. And now the question becomes, what do we do with the other $95? I don't need to pay for it for security, so I don't have to give it back to stakers, but I do have $95.
What do you do with the $95?
So what Arbitrum does with the $95 is all of that $95 flows into a wallet controlled by the Arbitrum treasury. In order to move those funds out of the Arbitrum treasury, you need a vote by the token holders. So the token holders have smart contract control of all of the revenue generated by Arbitrum. Today, I checked earlier this morning, outside of the ARB tokens, which are in the community's control, which is about like 2.6 billion tokens, the Arbitrum token holders have control of $150 million of non-ARB assets. And in order to remove those assets from control, you have to have a token holder vote. So the token holders play a very critical role in the economics of the chain. The token holders can vote to distribute it to token holders in what would be almost like a quasi-dividend style event. They can choose to reinvest it into growth of the protocol. You can do any of these things by giving the control to the token holder. So governance plays a critical role in Arbitrum. Most other ecosystems do not actually do this. A lot of the revenues go to foundations and the foundations decide. There's a critical difference from my perspective, and it could be because I'm a lawyer, spend a lot of time in corporate governance. Giving it on-chain into smart contract control by token holders is very different than a foundation that you don't really have control over. And that's a very important difference. We've thought about this from first principles. So even the Arbitrum Foundation, which plays a much more minimal role in the growth of Arbitrum compared to other ecosystems, the token holders can vote to remove directors by token holder vote, and that's baked into the Arbitrum Foundation's bylaws. So this whole thesis we have of token holder control and the value of governance has been like a core critical thesis in how we've designed Arbitrum and the Arbitrum token design.
I don't want to go too far down in the weeds on that front, but I do remember back in 2023, like when I think it was called a DAO at the time. I don't know if you guys still call it a DAO.
Yeah.
Okay, still DAO. Yes, an operating DAO at that. Not all DAOs are good. But I do remember it was hard getting it off the ground, and that like there was some like messiness on that front. So like it's good to see that, even if, the early days are rocky, these things kind of like pan out and, can run a chain.
We like to joke, like the first proposal that was proposed by the Arbitrum Foundation of establishing it was rejected by token holders. So if
they're like, no thanks. Yeah.
It's like, if you can't point to decentralization, I think that might be the best example of decentralization we can point to.
And
right?
I mean,
the establishment of the DAO.
I also spoke to Ed Felton, I believe his last name. A year or two ago, and we talked about like the governance and everything. And I said, isn't it scary to kind of like give token holders the power? And he was like, yeah, but you have to like trust that. He said it way nicer than that. But like,
I mean,
it does fall back into like, do you trust the community to like guide the ship and not like crash it? Right.
Yeah. So there's definitely, not to get too into this rabbit hole, but
I know, sorry.
There's definitely been like an evolution of like DAO governance in Arbitrum. I would say it's the most robust DAO. What we've done is try and find ways to improve operational efficiency, but maintain two core principles. One, the DAO should control all upgrades of the technology. Two, the DAO should control the power of the purse. If you maintain those two things and you build operational efficiency around it, that's the way to go. If you remove those two things, I think that's the beginning of a very dangerous slippery slope. Yeah.
Power of the purse. I like that.
I
control that. My house.
Right,
Do you control it?
No.
You brought up Robinhood before, and you said something about how the chain should be part of their product. You didn't say Robinhood specifically, but you said for L2s. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. And I'm curious, obviously, you've been probably working closely with the Robinhood team when they launched and announced back at the end of June. What do you think Robinhood wants their chain to become as part of their product? Yeah.
So again, for the people who are less familiar, and I think a really unique power of Arbitrum's platform, Robinhood in June, when they announced the launch of the tokenized stocks, it went live on Arbitrum One. So they were able to say, we are going to launch our core product, which is the tokenized stocks product, using the same technology stack, working with the same organization, the same counterparts, etc., and help design the chain. They didn't have to wait for the chain. They didn't have to work with different teams on different components. So that's a critical value proposition to understand. In terms of what they're doing with the chain, we're working with them now on the design features. I don't want to share too much. Obviously, that's still pretty confidential. But at a high level, it goes to that same point, which is they recognize their companies at their core mission is to democratize finance, and they are very well situated to be at the intersection of traditional financial or fintech and crypto rails. And they want their product to be opinionated about how do we bring these assets on chain for global expansion. So we're thinking through a lot of design questions around essentially how to design around their mission, right? And there's a lot of open points, but it's under the hood going to have a lot of considerations that match their broader vision as a company, as opposed to just launching a chain.
Yeah. I guess from your perspective then, what do you think is kind of the biggest opportunity to having these, I would call Robinhood a fintech massive entities coming into crypto and building their own chains, their own technology, using Arbitrum One, and kind of integrating into this on-chain world?
So I think that the coolest thing about this, and I always say this about Robinhood, the most exciting thing about this relationship for me is not that they're bringing crypto to their products, and to their users, it's that they're powering their current products with crypto. And we need a lot more of that. And we're starting to see that play out early in like the stablecoin discussions now about, how do we have more efficient remittances? Like people don't need to know. And if you look at like the Robinhood tokenized stocks app versus like the US app, which, I'm a customer, I'm not sure if you are, they basically look like the same thing. One is powered by traditional brokerage and one is powered by tokenized rails. And that's the most exciting thing to me. Like we talk about like bringing 1 billion users on chain. We don't need to do that by like disrupting enterprises. What we need to do that is by bringing the technology of a better system to existing infrastructure. I think it's like very different than like the social media revolution, where it was like, that was like maybe about like either gatekeeping or sovereignty around information. This is about what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring more sovereignty to financial transactions and financial activity, but you don't need to disrupt the existing infrastructure that people might be comfortable with in order to do that, right? Like, it's not like when social media was discovered, I could have wrote my own newspaper. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know, the analogy is not perfect, but like for me, I'm much more excited about like people utilizing crypto rails. They don't have to realize that
that they're on top of it.
They realize they have the power that crypto rails offer them, like self-sovereignty, censorship resistance, decentralization of this. That's important, but the user experience like doesn't need to reflect that, in my opinion, in order for us to bring 1 billion people on chain. Steven likes to always joke, when you watch a show on Netflix, it doesn't ask you if you want to like use their AWS or GCP service. It just like asks you what show you want to watch, right?
Yep.
And I don't think anybody thinks that just because we've migrated to streaming platforms and cloud-based services, that would be important information to service. Like that's sort of like, I think, the analogy of what I find most exciting of like, Robinhood and a lot of the other fintechs that we're working closely with.
Yeah, I actually read during, I think it was the Robinhood announcement, like Steven's blog post, essentially said like Arbitrum's success will be kind of measured by its ability to fade into the background. And I imagine you agree with that too. And it's something that I've heard before as well from other like technologists in the space is like, sure, they're very highly technical, but that doesn't mean everyone in the world has to be in order to adopt this technology, right?
Exactly.
And it's for the best if they don't know, like if I throw a bajillion jargon words at someone, they're going to be lost on the first one. Yeah. But if I told them that it makes their life easier, they're like, thanks.
Right. Exactly. Okay. The only thing I would say is I do wish, and I think like it's important with who you work with and to understand their visions. I do still think it's important for like people to recognize that blockchain architecture can provide a lot of sovereignty to what you're doing, right? Like it's not like just more cost effective or cheaper to use versus traditional rails. It does give you more power. And I do think that that's a really important, component of what we're trying to ultimately do.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is kind of the timeline for that hidden in the background type of movement, or I guess not movement, but like that next step where it's like Arbitrum One is just powering things and like people don't even know it?
If you look at the Robinhood like EU app and they have tokenized stocks, like it's 100% happening. We're building a lot more infrastructure around smart accounts, account abstraction, paymasters. All of the infrastructure necessary to bring that vision is stuff that, interoperability between blockchains, like these are all like really important components. We like to say at Offchain Labs that we like to solve the hardest problems in this industry. So Offchain Labs built Arbitrum, which is really about scaling technologies, whether it's a public blockchain or allowing you to launch your own. We also are the core builders and contributors of Prism, which is the leading staking client for Ethereum. So that's about like blockchain security. And we think the next thing is about this user experience layer. We're doing work on interoperability. We're doing work around account abstraction, all that kind of stuff to really, what we think is the next sort of major hurdle mountain to climb or hurdle to jump over is this user experience layer. So I think you're right. I think it's starting. I think it's going to accelerate a lot. Obviously, I think you wrote an article about like Stripe and Privy, and I think a lot of the work that the way they're thinking about payments, like everyone's rowing in that direction.
Right.
And it's like really cool to see.
Yeah, we had Privy on the other week too. Henry Stern came on, so that was fun. That. Yeah, but AJ, there's like 50 different topics we could cover with you, and I think we're just gonna have to do a part 4, 5, or 6 with another person or you from Offchain again. But before I let you go, I always like to ask guests, can you leave us with a piece of advice, something that you've carried with you throughout your time in this space?
That's a good question. I wish I had done that one in advance.
No, that's the fun of it. Yeah, you don't get to know.
I don't get to know. Advice that I have, I think people think that there's shortcuts in this industry. There's no shortcuts. There's nothing that replaces hard work, establishing really close relationships, trying to create value, building real businesses. That's the thing I've learned. I think that a lot of people have tried shortcuts. I haven't found that shortcuts in this industry work if you're really trying to create really sustained value. And I would urge and recommend people to recognize that. How's that one?
That's a great one. I agree 100%. Amazing. AJ, thank you so much for coming on today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.